Let's take a look at file redaction as we continue our study of searching. Here's our problem statement. Sometimes when documents are made public, they have sensitive data removed. If you do an internet search on redaction, you'll see lots and lots of examples of this. Now, an example that I'm familiar with is accreditation documents. In order for our program to be accredited, we have to make copies of student work. But it's nobody's business which student did that work, so we have to copy out the names. The way we do it is sometimes with a black marker or sometimes with Adobe Acrobat or some software like that. But that's how we actually remove the student names from the papers to protect the privacy of the students. Now, this process is called redaction. It's actually very common, particularly in government security. So let's redact a file by removing all the int values. Now, you might be wondering, why would you do something like this? Well, one of the big reasons now is to remove social security numbers. You really don't want to have sensitive data like that any place that somebody can get at it because of security reasons. There's some very important protections of privacy that computer scientists are responsible for, and this is a big one. The first step we're going to do is to read the input from one file and write it to another file. Now, this is a process we haven't done before, and it's a good idea to start with this first before we start dealing with the redaction. So, the question is, how do you know when the file ends? Well, there's a method called hasNextLine that tells you when you run out of file. This method doesn't work when you're reading from the keyboard with a scanner because the keyboard never ends, but files do end. There are only so many characters in them, and so this makes sense to use with files. Now, all of the scanner methods have a paired method. So, for example, there's a hasNextInt, there's a hasNextDouble, there's a hasNext, which just looks to see whether the next operator will be successful or not. What these methods are doing is a peek. They're looking ahead to see if that next operation will be successful. So that's kind of nice because with files, you can't go backwards. Now, writing files is something else we haven't done. There's a class called PrintWriter that we're going to use for this. It's constructed similar to a scanner, so you'll do PrintWriter writer equals new PrintWriter of new file, and then the file name. The file name, of course, being a string. Now, this file is going to be placed in your project home directory in Eclipse. If you need it to be placed somewhere else, then you have to give a full path for it. Now, there are lots and lots of print methods in the API. They're called print and print line, and they work very much like system out print line. They're slightly different in subtle ways, but they work the same. One big difference is system out print line requires everything to be a string. Print and print line don't. You can print any kind of data you want, ints, doubles, strings, whatever. If you're interested in it, go and read the Java API. This part of the API is quite readable. Now, these methods are going to have to throw a file not found exception, because anytime you're writing to a file, just like when you're reading one, it's possible that this operation could fail. Maybe, for example, you're trying to write to a directory where you don't have permissions. And so Java insists that you throw a file not found exception, not only from the method that opens the file, but from any method that calls the method that opens the file. In other words, it works very much like the scanner does when we're reading files. So, let's take a look at a program that reads in one file and writes it out to another file. So we have public static void. Now, I've called it redact numbers because that's what it's eventually going to be. And we're taking a string file name and throwing a file not found exception. So the first thing we do is open a scanner for the input file, and then we open a PrintWriter for the output file. So notice the output file I've put redacted text because that's what it's going to be eventually. So all that the method body looks like is just reading in one line at a time and writing that same line out. So as long as our input file has more lines, we read it using nextLine, and then we do output file.println of that line that's just read in. Then at the end, remember, we close the input file and close the output file. It's especially important to remember to close those output files because if you don't close them, they won't be saved. And if they're not saved, you're not going to be able to see them, and you're going to think your program isn't working when it's actually just a very simple mistake. Now we're ready to move to thinking about the redaction. What we're going to have to do is read in lines with a scanner, just like we've done in the previous program, but now we're going to have to pull the line apart a little bit at a time. So we're going to repeat while the line has words left using has next, and then check to see if the next word is an int. Now the way you do that is using has next int. If so, then you redact it. Now when you redact files, you don't just remove the data. You have to put a mark in there showing that it was redacted. So I'm going to put the word redact in, so that way people will know that data was removed from the file. This is the proper way to do this. We're not trying to do anything sneaky. We're just trying to protect people's privacy. Otherwise, if it isn't going to be redacted, you just print the word. So this is an easy way to do this. Here's a method that does it. This is going to be public static void redact line, and it's going to take a string line, so we're letting the other method do the reading, and a print writer for the output file. So we'll have a scanner. Input line is new scanner of line. So what's happening is we're using a second scanner to pull apart the line in the file one word at a time. Then we'll say while input line has next. So we're looking to see if there are still more words that are left on the line. And then we look and see, is the next thing that's going to be read in an integer? If it is, we write out redacted with a space after it. And then we do input line.nextInt. So what we're doing here is skipping over the next integer that's in the input line, and in the output file putting redacted. Otherwise, we do what we did before. We take the word and we read it in using next, and then do output file.write, and then the word plus a space. That's the end of the while loop, and that's how we redact a single line. Of course, we would have to call this method in another method that's reading in the file one line at a time. Now, there are some very serious shortcomings to this code. Remember, the scanner separates words on a line using tabs and spaces, and we restored it using only spaces. So this could actually change the contents of the file, because what we're basically doing is replacing tabs with spaces. That's not a good thing. Unfortunately, though, to do a better job of this, we'd have to write a much more complicated program. We also have an extra space at the end of each line. Now, things like this can be very hard to see. For example, tabs and spaces, just depending on how things line up, might not be visible at all. And the extra space at the end of the line is only going to be visible if, in fact, you look through it with an editor to see that that space is there. So these are very subtle problems that could exist. And there is another shortcoming too. Suppose we had ABC123. HasNextInt is going to return false with that because it can't read in the ABC part. So we're probably not going to get all the numbers out of the file either. So this isn't perfect code, but it does show you how to use some great methods in the scanner class and shows you how to search for integers in a file. So keep programming.